Buonasera, buonasera a tutti.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Stefano SACCHI from Politecnico di Torino, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Harold James. Harold is an economics historian, he's professor at Princeton, he is director of the Contemporary European Politics and Society programs, and he's also professor at the School of Public and International Affairs.
La ricerca del professor James,
Professor James has wrote over 25 books, and then I had to stop at a certain point. And his research work mainly focuses on three major areas: the history of the industry, the monetary and financial history, and the history of globalization. And I'd like to remind you just a few contributions about the history of industry. He wrote a very important book on the Krupp family, on as to the monetary and financial history. He wrote various books on Germany, Deutsche Bank, for instance, and more books on the Bank of England, about Euro, and about EMU. And as to the history of globalization, I'd like to remind you two publications, because I think that they will come back in today's discussion: The End of Globalization, 2002, and recently, 2023, Seven Crises, about the economic crisis that shaped, so the seven crashes that shaped the globalization, thus creating the conditions for its expansion. And there are a few places here at the front. So to set the stage for its expansion on the one side, and also to create some periods of deglobalization on the other side. Certainly, Professor James will talk about the history of globalization and the industrial history and the monetary and financial history for his talk. He's going to talk about Trump's anti-globalism and about what this might mean for the world, that is to say, for all of us. Professor James, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Grazie Stefano, è un grande piacere per me di essere qui, ma parlare in inglese, if I may. So it's really wonderful to be here, and thank you for that terrific introduction. What I want to think about this evening is simply whether what we're experiencing at the moment in a dramatic series of upheavals is really the end of globalization. And many people have this view and go around saying globalization is all over. It was a brief experiment that lasted maybe 30 or 40 years, and it's finished. And I think it's right to say that there is a profound sentiment in some countries that globalization is not working. And you may find that in this country, that people will say that globalization hasn't worked, and in particular, that you've been badly affected by the China shock, because we have a kind of conventional story that Italy was the champion of many household goods, household durables. When I was growing up in Britain, suddenly all the washing machines and the refrigerators were made in Italy, and in a sense, you were at the front of a kind of globalization that was already there in the 1970s. And then in the 2000s, you're really, really badly hit by the China shock. And the China shock is a big story in the United States, and many people in the United States will think that they're particularly affected by it, and that they, as a consequence, really demand a radical action. And if we think about globalization, we have to think of it in terms of many aspects. It's not just about trade. It's not just about the production of goods. It's about the flow of ideas. It's about the flow of money. It's about the flow of people. And the reaction, the backlash against globalization tends to involve all four of those. And so, for instance, in the United States in the current climate, there's a belief that the big universities, including my university, are centers of a kind of globalist infiltration, and that, for instance, there was an article the other day in the Wall Street Journal about how the Kennedy School in Harvard, the equivalent public policy school to the one that I'm in Princeton, that the Harvard Kennedy School has become the party school for the Chinese Communist Party. So there's a sense that there's an infiltration. What I want to try to show, and I hope I can convince you, is that there are many chance aspects to this story, and that what's happening in the United States is not, I think, indicative of a much broader move against globalization. On the contrary, if you go around the world, and you go in particular to the big emerging countries, not just China, but also Brazil, India, but also smaller countries, Vietnam, they're full of enthusiasm about globalization. So the story is really that the center or the locus of globalization is changing. Just to show you how chance all of this is, I thought I would begin with a story. So a piano. This is the piano, or the same model of the piano, that was featured in a film. It's so iconic that I think many of us grew up with this film. It was made in 1942. It was a sleeper at first, but then it became very, very popular. And everybody knows Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman in Casablanca. The piano that was featured, is featured very prominently in the bar in Casablanca, was sold at an auction in New York in 1988 to somebody who remained anonymous. I think we still don't know who bought this piano, but it was for $154,000. And the bidder who lost in this war, bidding war, who had set his heart on getting this piano from Casablanca, was a New York real estate developer called Donald Trump. And this particular incident, coupled with many of things that were going on in the late 1980s, how Japanese investors bought up the film studios and made the film studios into Sony Film, or they bought up the Rockefeller Center. It turned Trump into a convinced advocate of the need for radical measures against Japan, because Japan was just about to conquer the world. And at this moment, there were many, many books with titles like these. Lester Thurow is a more reputable economist than George Friedman is a political scientist. But the coming war with Japan, for instance, head-to-head, the coming economic battle among Japan, Europe, and America. So a conviction that Japan is out to dismantle American preeminence. And the particular story, I think, about the United States is that the worry about globalization is the worry about decline. And the best of these books in the late 1980s was Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. And Kennedy had the thesis that great powers get overstretched and they can't stay at the top for very long, and so there's a trajectory that Spain went on from the 16th century and the golden age of Spain. Britain went on from the 19th century, that the United States was on and that the Soviet Union was on. And he was obviously right about the Soviet Union. And then in the 1990s, people turned and said he's obviously wrong about the United States. But in fact, the story about relative decline is, I think, correct in the sense that it's almost inevitable. If you think in the middle of the 20th century, the United States accounted for over half of the world's manufacturing production. And the only other big makers of machine tools were Japan and Germany. And Japan and Germany had obviously just been defeated. So the United States was absolutely preeminent. And it was clearly also only a matter of time before other countries catch up. And that catching up process is another way of describing what we can think of as globalization. So let me turn to the term globalist, because that's a term that Donald Trump loves to use. And so the attack against Harvard, for instance, is an attack on globalists. It's an attack on the globalist elite. It's worth thinking where the term globalist was first used. I love the history of these words. So globalist was, I believe, first used by a German emigre political scientist, Ernst Jeck, in Columbia University to describe Adolf Hitler. It looks odd, but it is clearly also right that Hitler was aiming at a kind of world dominance. And Hitler famously had a globe on his desk, as did Stalin. And Stalin also thought of communism as a doctrine that could be exported all over the world. And so Ernst Jeck in the 1940s wrote this book in which he said that there are these powers that aim to be globalist, and they want to impose their doctrine on the rest of the world. And very, very quickly, after 1945, this flipped around to a term which you could use to describe the United States as trying to impose its views and its ideology on the rest of the world. And so the critics of United States overstretch or spread abroad, or critics of the Cold War, were always talking about globalism as well. And so that's the origin of this term that Donald Trump likes to use. And then you come to this year, and April the 2nd, Liberation Day, and the announcement of these stupendously high tariffs, and there he's got them on the board, and we know now how they were calculated, and many people, I think correctly, believe that they were generated by looking at a ChatGPT, because they really make no sense, but there is a simple formula related to the trade deficit to the United States that is at the basis of this calculation. Why, for instance, Lesotho gets 49% tariffs. You can't really think of Lesotho as a country that is going to erode the power of the United States, but Lesotho undoubtedly exports a lot of diamonds to the United States, and it also exports a lot of clothing to the United States. So those are the reciprocal tariffs. And you can see very much how the narrative of the tariffs is linked to the idea of reversing America's decline. So we want to stop that. America's destiny is reclaimed. We began to make America wealthy again. Well, we also know that didn't go all that well. And it's clearer and clearer that the costs of this are really gigantic. So there's a yo-yo game in which the tariffs are put up April the 2nd, and then they're taken down again, and then they're put up again, and people comment on this, some bits of it look very dramatic, that Trump wants to say we get away from this addiction to imported cheap goods, and children shouldn't have so many toys at Christmas, and they shouldn't have dolls, 2 dolls instead of 30 dolls. But there's a kind of caution about this, and pretty soon after that, the Treasury Secretary said, we're going to talk to China and we don't really want a decoupling, and the president said that he's going to talk to President Xi, and so there's a kind of negotiation about all of this. We get bits of globalism coming in terms of donated planes. But some people then think, well, this is automatically going to be reversed because the cost of this is so immediate, and you can really work out the exact costs, and it's very, very dramatic. It depends a bit what you're producing, but for instance, if you're a big producer of machinery and aero equipment, putting tariffs on steel and aluminium is not going to be making your industry great again. And so really great trade economist in Geneva, Richard Baldwin, says, actually, this is always going to be taken back. And a journalist in the Financial Times, Robert Armstrong, had a really beautiful phrase that has become viral, and it's absolutely infuriated Trump. That is TACO. Trump always chickens out. So invented by Robert Armstrong, and a couple of days ago, when a reporter came with a TACO message to a White House press conference, the president completely lost his nerve and exploded with rage. So this is the background to thinking about, is something like this really possible? Or are we just going to be in this yo-yo game for the next months or maybe years ahead until there's a political outcome in the midterm elections or at the next presidential election that reverses the course of all of this? And if so, is this something that is just such a temporary blip driven by the personality of this particular man with a particular story, that he's transferred all this emotion that he built up against Japan to thinking how to transfer that emotion to dealing with China? As Stefano kindly mentioned, I've been thinking about this kind of problem of the reversibility of globalization since the early 2000s, since the initial euphoria about globalization. And in The End of Globalization, that was a book that I did in 2001, I wondered whether something like the Great Depression can possibly occur again. It seemed to me at that moment that there was no big anti-globalist, persuasive anti-globalist belief system. I think that's changed in part, but it's also, I think, the case that many people just can't see any evidence at all of deglobalization in any statistical series. And so the most commonly presented one, I will go to it in a moment, is to say that world trade as a proportion of world output has stagnated since the mid-2010s, since about 2014, 2015. But even that is actually a little bit misleading because world trade as a proportion of world manufactured output is still going up. It's that world manufactured output as a proportion of the overall activity, economic activity of the world, has gone back. And that's because we sell less stuff to each other and we trade more in services. And we know that. We trade much more in services than we trade in goods. So as I said, I've always been fascinated, and Stefano made that point nicely in the introduction, I've always been fascinated by the ups and downs of globalization, and that's what I was thinking about in the latest book. But let me show you something else. The difference between the World Trade Network and other bits of globalization. So globalization contains many, many different aspects. So there's trade, and that's the first thing that I think you think about, and that's the first thing clearly that Donald Trump was thinking about, that trade and tariffs are the way of responding to globalization. But if you look at the World Trade Network, you can see that the United States is not really a very big part of the World Trade Network anymore, but that China is right at the center of the World Trade Network. And the United States putting tariffs on goods may be terrible for the United States. I think it is terrible for the United States, but it doesn't really affect very much, and it can't possibly push other countries into deglobalizing either. There's a big contrast, on the other hand, between the way in which the network of the global financial system operates to the way in which the global trading system operates, that the United States really is at the center of the global financial system. And if you think where deglobalization might take place, it's much more likely to take place in the context of an explosion of the global financial system than it is of an implosion of the international trading system. So this is where the sensitivity is, and this is where the potential reaction to what the United States is doing may be very, very severe. So this is really where the centerpiece of the discussion has been going, and it's produced a extremely inconclusive debate. In particular, a paper that had little attention at the time when it was published last year by Stephen Miran grabbed the headlines when he was appointed as the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. And the key point of Miran's paper is that the United States has lost out, and so he wanted to diagnose this story of relative decline, which I explained in a very harmless way. Relative decline is just because other countries are catching up. But he said relative decline is because the United States is the major financial center of the world, and because the consequence of that is that there are continual inflows of money into the United States. So he calculated what's been flowing in since the 1980s and came up with a big figure of $30 trillion, really large figure, so bigger than the annual GDP. And he says that this is the sign that the rest of the world is exploiting the United States. They're treating us as something that can be exploited. They want a safe asset. We give them a safe asset. The consequence is that our industries decline. And to some extent, there's a logic behind that, and he tried to give that historical parallel in the sense that in the 1970s, end of the 1960s already, there was a similar kind of story in that people were worried about a loss of American jobs and a loss of American competitiveness. And President Nixon, in August 1971, in a kind of celebrated moment, put on an emergency tariff of 10% and suspended the gold convertibility of the US dollar and said, we're going to use the tariffs in order to beat the rest of the world in getting a fairer exchange rate system. And they got that in December 1971, and it didn't last for very long. Or in the middle of the 1980s, similar story, because the dollar really surged against other currencies in the first half of the 1980s because of the mix of fiscal and monetary policy, expansive fiscal policy and very tight monetary policy. And that also looked as if it was producing a lot of job losses. That's the background to the Japan discussion. And in 1985, Treasury Secretary James Baker pushed the other big industrial countries, the G7, to accepting policy measures that would drive down the US dollar and make the dollar more competitive. And he said explicitly, if you don't do this, we won't be able to resist the pressure in Congress for trade protectionism. So the key discussion point that Miran took up is historically correct. But actually, that's all that it is. It's a historical point, and it's not really very helpful for the present, because in particular, if you think if the trade measures really were applied, what that would simply do is to push up the dollar. And so it would make the situation of American workers even worse. So trade tariff measures are destroying more jobs. And if they really work in this way on the dollar and they push up the dollar, so what is Miran looking for? Well, here, let me make a little bit of a radical suggestion, if I may. If this analysis really makes sense, and it clearly is right that there's a link between the current account situation and these flows of dollars into the United States and the trade political situation, other countries might say, and Europeans might say, well, Donald, we can help you. We can do something really constructive. What we could do is to put a tax on investments in the United States. We could do our own bit of deglobalization to help you in your deglobalization. We put a tax on investments in the United States, and that will automatically correct your position. That's a much more helpful way of dealing with this than it is by tariffs. By the way, you can see the full dilemma that the United States has got itself into in the recent budget bill. In section 899 of the budget bill, there's a provision that in some kind of unspecified emergency or a diagnosis that something unfair is going on, the United States can take measures to recoup some of the damages by seizing the return on foreign investments in the United States. So this is exactly the same measure, but it's likely to generate, it is already indeed generating a lot of nervousness. Let me go back briefly to the big history of globalization, because I think in the end, if you want to think of how and why we're in this situation, we might want to think about the longer-term history, and that's what, as a historian, I like to do. So Joseph Schumpeter, in 1919, wrote like almost everything that Schumpeter wrote, a brilliant diagnosis of the catastrophe that had just hit the world, particularly Europe, with the First World War. And where he explained that nationalism and militarism that produced 1914, produced conflict, are atavistic ideas. They're not intrinsic to the nature of a market economy or a capitalist system, but they come from the outside and they destroy capitalism. And the person he quoted was, in a way, a much more polite version and a much more dignified version of what Donald Trump is in the United States today, Joseph Chamberlain. Joseph Chamberlain was from the industrial heartland of England in Birmingham, and he was obsessed with the idea of British decline. So very, very much like the decline discussion in the United States. Schumpeter is quoting Chamberlain and quotes him in English. And the two things that Chamberlain constantly emphasized was need to think imperially and tariff reform means work for all. So tariffs and thinking imperially were the political project of this great oratorical figure, Joseph Chamberlain, but never in his lifetime implemented. Some bits of it were implemented by his son, who became Prime Minister, called Neville Chamberlain, and pushed in 1932 Britain's transition to a high tariff regime, and then in the late 1930s is one of the architects of the collapse of the international system in Europe in terms of the diplomacy that he embarked on in 1938 with Adolf Hitler. Let me get briefly to this figure of trade and world output, because it's the best way, despite the limitations I already mentioned. We shouldn't necessarily take this stagnation in the last bit of that figure too seriously, but it's the best way of getting a sense of the overall trajectory of globalization. And you can see two periods in which globalization surged and one period in which globalization collapsed. So the collapse is after the First World War and in the Great Depression, and the surges are in the middle of the 19th century and in the 1970s and 1980s. That's really the fundamental basis, I thought, for thinking about what may or may not happen, what is likely to happen, because the moments that caused globalization to surge in the past were a specific kind of economic crisis. Negative supply shocks. Whereas, so negative supply shocks, globalization surges, and negative demand shocks, when a financial crisis or a series of financial crises, contagious financial crises, bring the world down. That's the World Depression. That's what threatened in 2008 as well. How can we tell the difference between a supply shock and a demand shock? Well, it's in a way a very, very simple economics 101 exercise that in a supply shock, prices move in a different direction to the volume of output or the volume of goods exchanged. And in a demand shock, everything moves in the same direction. So in the Depression, prices fell and production fell and trade fell. But in the middle of the 19th century, there was a really acute supply shock. And that's, I think, most easily envisaged. In the United States, it's easy to do that because a lot of the audience has some kind of Irish background. You think of the Irish famine. But the potato famine, the failure of the potato in the middle of the 1840s, was not just an Irish phenomenon, it was all over Northern Europe, and it was the consequence of a succession of rainy, wet summers in which crops molded and crops were destroyed, and Europe couldn't feed itself. And the result was then a series of political revolutions as well, and you obviously know that story very, very well in Italy. In my typology of crises, this mid-19th century shock is the crucial one, because what it does is to convince people that governments haven't handled this very well. There's an enormous literature on how the British government mishandled the Irish famine in the 1840s and intensified the Irish famine. So it was an interaction, for instance, between, they start off by creating food kitchens, soup kitchens to feed the Irish population. They need to import food. That affects the exchange rate. Then they decide that the exchange rate is threatened, so they need to cut back budget expenditure. So they cut back the food kitchens at the moment that the famine is getting worse. Or even worse, they say, we need to make sure that we tax the Irish in order to pay for these soup kitchens. And so they obviously can't tax the very, very poor, the people who are starving, but they tax the middle people in Ireland. And these are the people who run shops and actually supply the food. And so they think, well, we can't deal with this. We're going to emigrate. And the Irish famine produced not just a massive number of deaths, millions deaths, but also a substantial emigration. So governments fail, and that's clearly the perception all over Europe, that one government after another was discredited. And so governments in the aftermath of the revolution really change themselves, and they think they need to be more competent. And one of the things that they can do to be more competent is that they can allow the technology that was already there to be applied to solve the problem. And the technology is the steam engine. So there was a steam engine. Steam engines are old. There were steam engines in the 18th century. The famous Watt and Boulton steam engine, the patent for that is in 1776. Steam engines were old, and there were tiny little bits of railroad, but there aren't these big railroad systems, and there aren't the big transatlantic shipping lines that will get the food from the rest of the world to feed Europe. So technical innovation, it doesn't need to be made, it's already there, but it can be realized in the wake of a supply shock, because you really need a demonstration of government competence. Then, don't want to talk about the setbacks to globalization, but in the 1970s, that's the moment that we get the new wave of globalization. That also follows from a negative supply shock, from the consequence of the political upheavals, the 1973 war, the oil price increases, and the question of how to respond to that. And again, it's a very similar story in the sense that the technology is already there. The technology, in a way, it's a repetition of what happened in the middle of the 19th century. The technology was the container ship. There were container ships. There was a proto-container ship in the 1930s. In the 1950s, there are container ships that regularly go from New York to Florida, but most ports in the world can't handle container ships because there's resistance. Trade unions, UK, the dock workers, are very sensitive to containerization. And then you're faced by a big shock, and you say, well, we need these container ships. We need to reduce the cost of shipping. Then you really follow through with an enormous expansion of global trade. So what I want to suggest is that we're actually in something, and that's really what fundamentally the world is responding to at the moment, that is generated by a particular supply shock. And so we're in a supply shock that came after the COVID shock. And COVID really cut the essential supplies. And it also did exactly what these supply shocks in the 1840s or in the 1970s did. It challenged the competence of governments. Governments didn't look very competent. Some did a bit better. Sweden did better. New Zealand did better. But most governments responded pretty poorly to the pandemic. But above all, things became short. And so at first we thought, well, what are the shortages? Semiconductors, computer chips. You couldn't get them. The ships were all stacked up in the wrong places. Shortage of semiconductors, that paralyzes everything else. The prices soar. That's characteristic of the supply shocks. And it focused the attention also on the technical change that is taking place, because that's also one of the key bits of these supply shocks, that you suddenly realize what technology can do. You need these computer chips if you're going to have all the electronic communication that we had in an intensive way in the aftermath of COVID. So you need the chips. But then how do you produce the chips? And more attention gets put on that. So in the transition report of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development a couple of years ago, they had a very, very nice diagnosis of the problem, and they had this long figure which lists all the things that are critical for the green transition, for any kind of technical transition. But it's very, very difficult. If you think of all of these things as being important, anyone who sits on any of these scarce goods can control something that's absolutely crucial. So it pushes the emphasis on your ability to control resources. And one of the things, I think, if you want a little bit of a kind of theory of everything to this, one of the things that made for a change in geopolitics in 2022 was that the Russian government knew that because it was a major exporter of energy, it had a kind of grip over Western Europe. And so they could use their control of energy to bend Western Europe to what they wanted to do. And so it makes the invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 22, look attractive. So this is the world in which we have these scarce goods, energy, but also, above all, these things that are listed in the EBRD report. Choke points. Everybody's looking for a choke point that they can control in this new world. So one of the things that came up in 2022, very, very suddenly and very abruptly, was that there was a shortage of neon gas. I don't believe that 99.9% of the population knew what neon gas was used for before February 22. But neon gas is an essential part of the production of semiconductors. It's also mostly produced in a rather odd way as a byproduct of a particular steel process that was only used in the Soviet Union. And so Russia and Ukraine were the big providers of neon gas. And then in February 22, that stopped. So you've got a shortage of neon gas. It's not that you can't do it somewhere else, but you need time to do that. It requires an adjustment. The EBRD report devotes a lot of attention to gallium and germanium that are essential for things like solar panels and a lot of the energy transition, but also for electronics. Until this year, I don't believe, in the same way that nobody knew about neon gas until 2022, I don't believe that many people were aware of the centrality of dysprosium. But dysprosium comes in the headlights after April the 2nd, because that's one of the goods that China wants to restrict the exports of. And it's dramatically catastrophic for the US computer industry. You need dysprosium. It provides a kind of magnetic shield. You need it for many, many supercomputing processes. You need it also for, if you want to do fusion technology for nuclear energy. It's got a very wide, it's in your iPhones. Everybody's got a bit of dysprosium. But we didn't realize how important dysprosium was until just a few weeks ago. And now this is one of the things that is driving Trump. The people in Silicon Valley, in American industry, push back and say, we can't have these Chinese export bans. So can you get over this? It seems to me that on the whole, we're in a situation that is like that of the middle of the 19th century, or like that of the 1970s, that we're going to have an era of accelerated technical innovation. And you can think, I think, also of the technologies that are already there, but that we got used to using in the aftermath of COVID, electronic communication, but also the mRNA vaccine was something older, but nobody could see a use of it until COVID. And then with COVID, it's very successful, and you can see also suddenly a use of the same mRNA technology to deal with common cancers. So we're in a moment of great, great technical advance. And so, briefly, if you want a kind of bottom line of this discussion, it is that we're in exactly the same kind of process of transformation as occurred in the middle of the 19th century or in the late 20th century. We're going to see more globalization. There are plenty of countries that are going to push globalization. It may be also that Europe is a beneficiary of what Trump is doing, because what the United States is doing is a peculiarly regressive move of just damaging itself because of an obsession with imperial decline. So I used to think that Trump was, the administration, the MAGA movement, was shooting itself in the foot with these measures. But I've stopped saying that. I now believe that it's both shooting itself in the head, it's intellectually completely stupid, and it's shooting itself in the heart, because this is also very, very damaging to large numbers of people all over the world, including in the United States, but all over the world. So the United States is embarked on a very, very peculiar course that I do not believe any other country will want to imitate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Harold, for this inspiring talk, and I'm sure it will... ci sono già delle domande in sala.
I'm already seeing some questions. We have a question in the front. Well, actually, let's start from the back. Good evening, Professor. You thought about there are new perspectives for a new globalization, but what I see is that we are in a time where we don't trust each other. Especially, we don't trust China because China is notorious for stealing our technology. We don't trust the US because the US, from one day to the other, at a certain sense, abandoned us from the NATO. And we also don't trust, maybe even at the end of the world, we don't trust Russia and other countries that put us in some difficulties in the last few years, maybe even before COVID. And I'm not referring to Russia right now, but China. So talking about a new globalization now that we are at a time of lack of trust, don't you think that there is a danger there?
Answer directly, or should...
No, it's such a good question and an important one. And I mean, indeed, it really is the other half of the story. But that's exactly why I wanted to use those historical parallels. Because, of course, in the middle of the 19th century, people didn't trust each other either. They didn't trust their governments. They wanted better governments. They were prepared to die for better governments. In the 1970s, the 1970s were terrible. It did terrible in Italy, terrible in Europe. There was a great book by a French political scientist, Jean-François Revel, on how democracies die. Everybody thought that democracy was over in the 1970s. So these are moments. These are very, very bleak moments when people are very despondent. And what you need. I mean, I think your diagnosis is right about the politics, but it's an old problem. We can't go on with suspicious minds. It's a kind of Elvis Presley story. Suspicious Minds. You remember this great song. How can you overcome that suspicion? Well, you need to think of ways of making democracy better, including more people. It's a long story, but I think there will be a push to democratize this well. And some democracies function quite well as well.
Sir, you ended your intervention with the metaphor of the administration shooting in the head. My question is whether this is really possible to happen? So that administration to die, not to die before the 4-year term because of some reason, or so if we can expect the Trump administration to terminate the mandate before the 4 year, for whatever might happen, or if that's not feasible.
Well, I think Mr. Trump is very determined to stay in power. So I think he will try to stay in power. But it seems to me that there are two big challenges to Trump, and we've already seen them emerging. One is the, since we're in an economic festival, and we want to celebrate economics a bit, we should celebrate the bond market, because the bond market is what is most likely, most quickly to destroy Trump. And it's exactly the attention of the bond market to something like Section 899 of the big, beautiful bill that is likely to cause an explosion. And people are very, very sensitive to what their retirement investments do. They're sensitive to the stock market. Donald Trump is sensitive to the stock market. I think this is the big explanation of these movements, putting tariffs on, taking them off over the last last months. The other story, though, is the Constitution of the United States and the court system of the United States. There are so many legal challenges to many of them. I mean, including the tariffs. Last week there was the ruling that the tariffs are illegal. I think it's very, very clear that the constitutionality of April the 2nd was clearly flawed. And it may be that there are alternative workarounds. But fundamentally, tariffs are a tax. And tax is a matter of Congress. Congress has to decide on taxes, and if Congress is worried about the bond market, it's not going to do that. So those are the ways that the administration will stymie itself. It's been hyperactive over the last months, but it seems to me that it's likely to run into these two fundamental checks.
Yeah, so Harold, I mean, I thought you gave a very sort of wonderful interpretation of the concept of American exceptionalism, which of course is a big theme in American history. And I'd really like to believe that this sort of strong anti-globalization movement that we see in the United States is in some sense unique. But you could make a counter-argument that what is happening in America is only an extreme manifestation of a set of new nationalist sentiments that are permeating many other countries, and that the concept of America first is not unique to America. And I think what we have seen, in the last 20 years is a resurgence of nationalist sentiments, even chauvinist sentiments, in which many countries basically take a far more sort of internally looking view. And where this is particularly critical is in the attitude toward immigration, which you mentioned early on in your talk. Mm-hmm. And in that regard, the United States, again, is an extreme example of phenomena that we see in many other countries. So I really hope you're right, but I wish I could see that as more than a difference of degree.
Yes. I mean, in a way, I think that was why the first question was so important. That what there is wide distrust of other countries, other people. And that is in countries that are very economically successful. The United States is economically successful. We're not in any kind of a big economic crisis. So the talk about American decline from that point of view is silly. Or Poland today has a really critical election. Poland is one of the great economic success stories of Europe. So it's difficult on any kind of economic interpretation to say that they're voting, if they're voting for a populist right candidate, they're voting because of economic pressures. They're not. They're voting because of ideas of the nation. There's a systematic belief, and you know, I think it's a driver in Central Europe in particular. So Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, they think that at some point they've been betrayed by somebody, and they have these long historical narratives. So Hungary thinks it was betrayed in 1919. Poland believes it was betrayed in 1939 because the British and French didn't support it seriously, or in 1945 because the United States didn't back it against the Soviet Union. Czechoslovakia was betrayed in 1938. So you know, they have these stories, and there's some kind of plausibility about all of these stories. What's the way of dealing with it? Well, not just with economic success, but it's also in terms of getting a viable and credible international system and multilateral institutions. And you know, this is what builds confidence and what builds trust. So I think there are mechanisms, but you know, I think your diagnosis is right in the sense that this is shared. But it also seems to me that there's a learning effect, and you know, we've seen this learning effect from time to time. You know, countries can be a case study of really good policy, but countries can also be a case study of really bad policy. And there's one country, I'm afraid to say, that has given an example of really bad policy in Europe at the moment. And that's you know, you can tell by my accent where I come from. So what Britain did in 2016 in having this unthought out referendum with a very narrow result to exit from the European Union, it had a profound effect in the sense that no other European country wants to do that. And so you've had that effect of the discussion in Italy. You have it in Hungary as well, that whatever Viktor Orban does, and he is constantly attacking the European Union, he doesn't want to get out of the European Union. Nobody in Poland wants to get out of the European Union. So you know, this is a story of how not to do it. And you know, then, if you think that wasn't enough, in 2022, the British government had a brief-lived episode when they had a seriously crazy budget. And at the time already, I think many people were warning that this budget, the Liz Truss budget, Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the finance minister who did this, that this was a serious warning about the bond market. You know, and at the time, Janet Yellen, who was then the Treasury Secretary in the United States, really played up the British example as a warning to Congress of what could go wrong in the United States. So, you know, if you think that Brexit is a bad example, Trump is setting a much, much worse example. And it means, I believe, that people who think that they want to associate themselves with Donald Trump in other countries will look very, very foolish, and you know, they will look for alternatives.
Thank you. So we have less than 2 minutes.
Well,
Two very short questions and 2 very short answers.
Thanks for your lecture. You suggested that some of the policies by Trump, like tariffs or also universities, might be illegal. But he hinted at the possibility of not respecting court orders and stuff. So my question is, how solid do you think the US legal system is? And do you see some risk of some sort of constitutional crisis? Or like, how do you think this will play out?
I mean, in a sense, there is already a constitutional crisis. You know, what we see at the moment is that Donald Trump is deeply, deeply upset about the American legal system. And so the most recent object of Trump's attack has been a kind of association of conservative lawyers, which was very, very important in terms of providing the candidates for the first Trump administration to the Supreme Court nomination, the Federalist Society. He's absolutely infuriated by the devotion to the principles of the American Constitution. And so, yes, we are in a constitutional crisis, and we really have to see how that plays out.
Marco.
Okay, Harold here. Okay,
yeah.
Beautiful lectures. Just one observation. Your cobweb of trade relations.
Yes.
You know, the two thick arrows going from the United States, the thickest one were to Canada and Australia, and you have seen the political backlash there.
Yeah.
In both countries, anti-Trumpian actually won the election. So this is no. My question is the following: I have a panel tomorrow, so you are all invited. What should Europe do given the offensive of Trump? Should they retaliate or keep cool and just let the storm off?
They should retaliate. They can't just stand there and do nothing. I mean, in effect, also, I think what you've seen with the Chinese story is that China retaliated very, very quickly and very dramatically and very effectively. And you know, that story of Chinese-US trade is very interesting in the sense that the biggest export of the United States to China are agricultural goods, primarily soybeans. But China can get soybeans from many other places. But we can't get many of the technical goods, and we can't get the complex products. Europe is in exactly the same situation, that you know, if it's a trade struggle, the United States would lose. But I think, if I might make a suggestion for your panel, the genius move is to say that we tax investments in the United States. You can dress that up as helping the United States.
Professor James, thank you so much.